Yep, they're among the quickest vehicles currently on the market, and they're quite affordable. The BYD Seal Performance versus the MG4 XPower. For this virtual drag race, I'll break it down and turn it into a bit of a comparison. I have driven both models, so we'll just talk about a bit about the handling and how they are to live with, as well as compare the specs. Let's get stuck in. Firstly, the price. So the MG4 wins this. It starts from $55,990 excluding on-road costs, while the BYD Seal starts from $68,748 excluding on-road costs. So there's a big disadvantage to the BYD, or sorry, a big advantage to the MG4 for being such an affordable little package. But with the BYD, you do get a bigger battery, blade technology as well. But as you'll see later on, it's not very light in weight, but it is a bigger vehicle. But anyway, it's a 82.5 kilowatt hour battery versus a 64 kilowatt hour battery in the MG. And that means you get 520 kilometers range WLTP in the BYD versus 400 kilometers in the MG4 WLTP as well. Both have twin motors, so that's all-wheel drive, excellent grip. You can drive these things pretty fast, even in wet conditions on very tricky roads and technical roads, and they just grip up and catapult away from corners. Astonishing performance, really, again, especially for the price range that they're in. But yeah, with the BYD, you are getting more power, 390 kilowatts versus 320 in the MG4. So straight away, there's a bit of an advantage to the BYD in terms of the drag racing. But if we have a look at the weight and break down the power to weight ratio, so the BYD weighs 2,185 kilograms versus just 1,800 kilograms in the MG4. The MG4, that's actually a pretty lightweight for an EV, and it's not a small vehicle. Like, it might look like a little hatchback, but it's actually pretty big, especially inside. They've done a lot with space efficiency designing that thing. So yeah, you can fit pretty much 5 passengers in there, and it's got a decent sized boot, which we'll get to in a second as well. But that means if you calculate the power to weight ratio, you've got 178 kilowatts, or 178.49 kilowatts per ton in the BYD versus 177.78 kilowatts per ton in the MG4. So very, very close power to weight ratios. And in fact, the official 0 to 100 claim is 3.8 seconds for both vehicles. By the way, I'm getting all my facts from Redbook. They're not completely trustworthy. They get some facts wrong sometimes, like the power output. It's saying 300 kilowatts for the MG4, which it says on the MG website that it's 320 kilowatts. So, but if you know of any of these facts that are wrong, let me know and I'll pin a comment in the video so everybody can see the correction there. The BYD offers 150 kilowatt DC charging, while the MG4 offers just 140 kilowatts. Sorry, not just 140, just slightly down on the BYD. So they both charge pretty quickly. 150 kilowatts is a typical fast charger in Australia at this time. You can find 350 kilowatt chargers. They're pretty rare, or 180 kilowatt I think I've seen. But 150 is pretty much the sort of maximum of a mainstream sort of pretty average charger. But with the MG4's battery being a little bit smaller, it is a little bit quicker to charge. The top speed for the BYD is apparently 180, but during our testing, it kind of slowed down, it basically stopped at about 195, whereas the MG4 is apparently 200 kilometers an hour. And I think it's slowed down just before that. So usually with a top speed cutoff or a limiter, it doesn't just like a red line and stop the vehicle, because that can be dangerous if you're going around a corner, a big bend or something like that on the track, and you're just about to approach the top speed and it just cuts the power. Then it's going to cause weight shift. The weight will jump onto the front axle, unweighting the rear, and you could loop the car or something like that. So usually with top speed limiters, they sort of slow down gradually. And yeah, the BYD, I've noticed, it slows down at about 190, but then sort of stops at 195. And then the MG4, yeah, it slows down at around 195 and then pretty much stops at 200. That is going to impact the 0 to 200 times, obviously, but the quarter miles, it should be okay. The BYD might just slow down just a little bit as it's crossing the quarter mile. In other areas, boot space is 400 litres in the BYD. It is just a sedan, so you don't get that practicality of a kind of SUV, if you can call the MG4 an SUV, more of a hatchback, I guess. And then, yeah, 363 litres in the MG4. With folding rear seats, you get 1165 litres. So in terms of practicality, I think the MG4 wins this because it's got the tailgate that pops right up and you can just fit things in the back. Whereas the BYD, it does have a little tub under the bonnet at the front, which the MG4 does not. So you do get a little bit of extra storage. You can put the charging cables and so on. You've also got a bit of underfloor storage in the boot at the back in the BYD. But yeah, overall, I think the MG4 is just a little bit more practical, higher ground clearance as well. 158 millimeters in the MG4 with 120 millimeters in the BYD Seal. It just means you can go into car parks and so on, go over speed bumps and not have to worry too much. But then again, the BYD Seal definitely looks better in my opinion. It's got that nice modern sports sedan look about it. It's got these cool little fins or little aerodynamic flourishes down on the seal panel. The front looks pointed and low and it's got a diffuser at the back. It definitely looks sportier. The BYD wears very cool 19-inch alloy wheels as well with 235/45 tyres, while the MG4 XPower 18-inch wheels with 235/45 tyres as well. But yeah, the BYD is bigger overall. It's longer, wider, with a longer wheelbase, but the MG4 is taller in terms of roof height. And then lastly, we've got warranty, 6 years and 150,000 kilometers in the BYD and 10 years and 250,000 kilometers in the MG4. So obviously the MG4 wins there. It's probably going to be, if you're going to keep it for 10 years, then yeah, the MG4 is definitely the one to go for. Now, just in terms of the driving dynamics and handling and so on, the MG4 is playful and friendly. It's not very well tied down. It's not hardcore, but you can take on a mountain road or something like that with reasonable confidence. That all-wheel drive system, you can just apply loads of power, as I said, and just pulls it around the corner very easily. It's kind of sure-footed and not too much trouble, whereas the BYD, it's lower to the ground for sure. It feels sportier when you're driving initially, but if you start pushing it, it's not very consistent in its feeling. So you're coming around some corners and so on, pushing it pretty hard, and everything's fine, but as soon as you just make a little adjustment, like back off on the throttle just a little bit or just dust the brakes just a little bit, you'll just get this surprise like, oh yeah, this is really heavy, and it just sort of catches up on itself kind of thing. It's hard to explain, but it just doesn't feel as consistent or as predictable as the MG4. Now the MG4 is no hardcore hot hatch by any means as well. It's pretty sort of bouncy. The suspension's got a lot of travel, which is great for bumps and things, but if you were taking them both on the track, I guess the BYD would be better, just because it's lower to the ground and flatter. Just that weird weight feeling that just creeps up on you. It's just a little bit off-putting and not as predictable. Whereas the MG4, I feel like you could thrash that around a mountain road and just have a bit more confidence in it because you know there's no surprises, if that makes sense. In terms of a driver's car or overall, what would I pick in terms of driving feel? I think I would just take the MG4 because it's just a bit more playful. It's not really promising anything. I mean, it's extremely quick, but it's not, you tend not to push it quite as hard because it's already telling you, hey, I'm just a little friendly SUV kind of hatchback with relatively narrow tyres for the power it's got, relatively average brakes. Like they do okay. It does have those orange plastic covers over the calipers, but they are bigger brakes than the standard MG4. But yeah, you tend to give it a bit more leeway because it's not promising to be anything special. Whereas the BYD, it feels really good most of the time, but then you just get these little surprises. So yeah, I think I would choose the MG4 because it's a bit more practical, it's cheaper, longer warranty, it drives a bit better in terms of its fit for purpose or its intended purpose. And then yeah, it's just as quick. But how quick is it compared with the BYD? Let's have a look at a virtual drag race and see. there we go. They both have the same claimed 0 to 100 time, but the MG4 just gets there in the end, extremely close. It's worth noting that the battery levels were not exactly even, which, you know, I guess that is an argument, but I feel like it's not, because if it's a petrol vehicle, you know, you don't say, oh, but you had 75% fuel in your car, you only had 70% fuel in your car. It doesn't make sense to me to compare that, although I do understand that some batteries will deliver maximum power when they are at full charge, and then when they start to decharge, or, you know, start to drop in charge, that the power output is not exactly consistent. I remember talking to a Hyundai engineer, and I know Porsche, they say they have repeatable performance all the way down to pretty much 0 or maybe 5% or 10% battery. Over the course of the last few years testing EVs, I have found that some do drop in performance a little bit when you go down below 50%. Not much though, I'm talking 0.1 of a second or not even that. Whereas these two, I don't know, I don't think that difference is enough to change the performance. But, you know, you could argue that if you wanted to have a full even drag race, you'd have 100% battery in both at the drag strip or whatever. But unfortunately, where I do the performance testing on a private road, it's in the middle of the bush, and there are no power points in the ground or on the trees or anything like that. But there we go. I think it's very interesting to have this level of performance available from this price range, like 55 grand for the MG4, or 60 grand by the time you put it on the road. That's incredible value for money, really, compared with 10 years ago. You wouldn't get anywhere near that level of performance. Obviously just in a straight line, but still I think it's pretty good. But more importantly, let me know what you think. What would you buy out of these two? Or maybe you'd buy none. You just get a petrol vehicle that might be a bit slower, but you'd rather that because of the sound and the increased engagement. Thanks for watching.